Welcome everyone to the first session in our online conference, Empire and Excavation, Critical Perspectives on Archaeology in British Period Cyprus, 1878 to 1960, jointly organised by the British Museum and CAARI. We've happily attracted a large and very international audience today, beyond CAARI's usual guests. So for those who I don't know, I'm Lindy Crew, CAARI's director, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our two-day event. Some of you may not know CAARI. We are a non-profit organisation registered in the United States, and we've been operating on Cyprus for over 40 years. CAARI is the only archaeological research centre on the island, and as such, we cater to the entire archaeological community, operating a hostel and a library for visiting and local scholars. We regularly host lectures, conferences, and an annual archaeological workshop in the summer. But now, as with everyone in this pandemic situation, we're moving our offerings online. We hope that you will join us in the future for some of our other events. You'll shortly be meeting my two conference co-organisers, Thomas Kiley, Cyprus Curator in the Department of Greece and Rome at the British Museum, who you can see on your screen, and Anna Reeve, PhD candidate at the University of Leeds, who you can also see on your screen. They will introduce the purpose of the conference and the structure of the programme over the next few days. Had we been able to hold this conference live in Nicosia this weekend, we would have been enjoying this evening a reception for participants at the residence of the British High Commissioner. We are grateful to the High Commission for their support, and we hope that we'll be able to take up their offer a year from now during a live conference. For now, I would like to invite our special guest, His Excellency, Mr. Stephen Lilly, the British High Commissioner in Cyprus, to say a few words of welcome to our guests and friends today.
Well, thank you, Lindy. Ladies and gentlemen, Kalimera, good morning. In fact, good afternoon. As Lindy says, I'm Stephen Lilly, the British High Commissioner here in Cyprus, and I am really privileged to welcome you to this very important seminar. I think it's fantastic that CAARI are collaborating with the British Museum. I think that's a treat for all the experts involved. It's also important for UK-Cyprus relations. And of course, this event, which focuses on archaeology during the British period, it comes in a significant year, 60 years since the end of British administration in Cyprus and the transformation of our relationship between Britain and Cyprus into not a colonial one, but a relationship of mutual respect and equality. Now, as Lindy says, I would have been delighted to welcome you to my residence. I am sorry that because of COVID, we can't do that. But I'm very pleased that the event is going ahead virtually and perhaps allowing even more people to participate, not just from UK and Cyprus, but from around Europe and beyond. As British High Commissioner, I often say that education, research and scholarship are very much at the heart of the UK-Cyprus relationship, with a huge number of Cypriot alumni of UK universities occupying important positions in every walk of Cypriot life. And archaeological research and scholarship are a very important part of that wider landscape of education links. Indeed, as your conference highlights, archaeology has been a part of the UK-Cyprus relationship since the start of the British period. I'm reminded of that on a regular personal basis since the official residence of the High Commissioner in North Nicosia was built by Rupert Gunnis, the Director of Antiquities during the colonial period. And indeed, some of the fruits of his research are still there at the residence. And archaeology remains a strong and vibrant part of our relationship. Following the late 19th and early 20th century excavations led by the British Museum, the Liverpool Museum and others, UK universities have maintained a strong connection to Cypriot archaeological research. This includes long-term projects by the universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow, two from the latter institution taking part in these events, as well as ongoing projects from students and staff from more than 20 institutions. In any normal year, undergraduate and postgraduate students from a number of UK higher education institutions come to Cyprus to excavate in the field and to study material in Cypriot museums. And Cypriot students go in the other direction, in particular to undertake PhD research. This two-way exchange forges lasting personal relationships between archaeologists in both countries, and it further enriches the people-to-people links between Britain and Cyprus. I'm particularly pleased that a further new connection to be forged by this conference will be the increased cooperation between the National Archives UK and international researchers into the past of Cyprus, represented here today with the contribution of a keynote lecture by Juliette Desplat. This is a very exciting collaboration indeed, and I extend my congratulations. I'm also pleased to let you know that the British High Commission in Nicosia is co-sponsoring the filming and production of a guided tour of the Kuklia archaeological site in collaboration with CAARI. And at least we will do that when COVID restrictions permit. And when we've done so, I believe that the short film will be added to this conference's online archive. I just want to conclude by saying that while virtual meetings save a lot of travel time, they can be just as difficult to organize as physical meetings. Indeed, they bring a whole set of new challenges of their own. And I know that a huge amount of effort goes into ensuring a successful event of this kind. So let me pay tribute to Lindy Crew and to everybody from CAARI and the British Museum for having put together today and tomorrow's event. I wish you all an enjoyable and productive conference, which is online and accessible, and hopefully connecting even more people than usual as you continue your discussions on empire and excavation. Thank you and Evcharisto.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your kind words. And congratulations. As we heard, we are planning on being able to do a video with the support of the High Commission. And we're going to be filming with the old excavations of the early British excavations at Kuklia, Palais Paphos, and also the current excavations undertaken by Professor Maria Iacovu of the University of Cyprus. And we will be, obviously, normally an archaeological conference includes a field trip, but for this year, it's going to be a virtual field trip. And we're very grateful to the High Commission and to Maria Iacovu for supporting us in this. And as soon as the pandemic situation has improved, we will be scheduling this filming. So I would now like to hand over to Thomas Kiley of the British Museum, who is going to introduce to you some of the themes of the conference.
Good morning, everybody, and I hope everybody can hear me clearly and see my, okay, yes, is that okay? Yeah. I've got about 10 minutes or so to introduce some aspects of the program you're going to hear today and over the next few sessions. Obviously, we can't squeeze the more than 24 people who submitted abstracts back in the spring of 2020. But I would like to stress that the speakers you are going to hear today and tomorrow are a sample of the very rich selection of papers we received in response to the call for papers. And we're very again, grateful to people for giving their time in offering papers. And we also appreciate that many people have been struggling over the pandemic crisis to do research and to get papers produced or abstracts produced. So we're very, very grateful for all of that. I'm just going to spend a little time outlining reasons why we're having this conference. And let me just get this right. Here we are. So I just want to tell a story. I'll begin with the Unicorn of Kuklia, or why our history of archaeology is important and why we organized this conference. I just want to begin with a story from the Renaissance. In his book, A Description of the Island of Cyprus, the Cypriot scholar and priest Etienne de Lusignan, who was a member of the famous family that ruled Cyprus for 300 years until the beginning of Venetian rule, he describes some archaeological discoveries at the site of the ancient city of Paletpakos in southwestern Cyprus, or Kuklia. Lusignan's account was published in slightly different Italian and French editions in 1573 and 1580, respectively. And in it, he describes many of the marvels of the island of Cyprus, including numerous ancient burials accompanied by rich grave goods, which had been uncovered by the villagers around Kuklia at this time. But more specifically, in what sounds like a more organized excavation in 1564, Lusignan relates how in an underground chamber approached by steps was found a king almost complete, un re quasi intero, and a unicorn intact, dry with its horn. Great story, and you can see from the text I put on the screen, there's a slight difference between the French and the Italian text, but they seem to describe the same thing. And there was also a carboncio, which is translated as a precious stone in the French edition, and this was an object that the villagers who first discovered the tomb were too afraid to touch in case bad luck would occur. Now, scholars have been arguing about what exactly Lusignan actually saw, but the real point of this story, apart from the fact that it's a very good story, sorry, I'm struggling with two different screens here. Yeah, it's a really good story, but it really gives you a central understanding of the fact that the history of archaeology is in fact as old as the history of archaeological discoveries themselves. And indeed, the two are inseparable. Looking, recording, digging, collecting, treasuring, or simply talking about ancient things, which is the literal meaning of the word archaeologia, link the present with the past, however much you conceive of the past. It links present and past in myriad ways and generates narratives of equally myriad kinds. People have no doubt been doing this for thousands of years, even if we don't know or cannot know the details. For example, what stories were told about the Middle Bronze Age pot, that more than 1,000 years old, that was deposited in the earliest levels of the sanctuary of Apollo Elates at Kourion, sometime around 700 BC. While archaeologists can only speculate about this in a range of more or less plausible ways, and I should stress that archaeologists have become a lot more nuanced about the importance of this kind of phenomena, the Iron Age community around Kourion who did this surely had a very specific reason or explanation for why they buried an antiquity in their newly established shrine. The second point of my story is that there is an intense relationship between past and present in another way. The story of the Unicorn of Kuklia is told in Lusignan's Choreographia, written in exile after the Ottoman conquest of 1570 and 71. This is the book that in many ways celebrates the antiquity and abundance of his home island from the perspective of nostalgia and loss, and from a position of displacement and diaspora. Lusignan's book, Archaeology and History, as well as Natural History and Ethnography, were deployed to evoke the wonder of his homeland, but also to lament the fact that he was in exile from it. And this just shows how powerful the antiquarian and archaeological imagination can be in putting people within their landscape, establishing their identities and their heritage. And this relationship between heritage and archaeology and modern identity is, of course, a very strong phenomenon as well. So let's get just to the point where I just wanted to explain a bit about the thinking behind this particular workshop. For a number of years now, I was wondering about how we would bring up to date a remarkable conference that took place at the British Museum in 1998. This was the 22nd Classical Colloquium held in December of that year. The Classical Colloquium is traditionally organised around themes relevant to the British Museum's collections and history, and usually reflects the research interests of its staff. The 1998 colloquium had an added element because it was in memory of Olivier Masson, who had recently died. And Masson, of course, would be known to many of you as one of the great historiographers of Cypriot archaeology and epigraphy, and much else besides. And Olivier had drawn for many years on the extensive museum's collections and archives for his own work. And significantly, Masson's activities and his interests in the history of archaeology really went back to the 1950s. His activities also spurred the historical research of other scholars of Cypriot archaeology, including staff at the British Museum, who frequently helped him with his research. In this context, I'd just like to pay tribute to two of our departed colleagues at the British Museum, to Veronica Tatton-Brown, who was the organizer of this conference in 1998 and who edited the proceedings. And she had kick-started the interest within the British Museum in the history of Cypriot archaeology to a considerable degree, publishing archival documents from sites such as Enkeli. And even before that, Donald Bailey, going back to the 1960s, was drawing very heavily on the archives of the British Museum in order to try and make sense of the collections from Cyprus, which he did so much to reorganize and make explicit after a period of neglect. So the workshop that was held in 1998 was very international. It included lots of great names in Cypriot archaeology, some of which sadly no longer with us, but it also included numerous young scholars who are now thriving in academic and museum environment. And it's great that we actually have some of the original contributors with us today as well. Robert Merleys will be delivering a paper in the later session. Michael Gibbon, whom we'll hear from in a moment, was one of the participants in that original conference. And this is the blurb from the published volume, and it simply points out how much this book was a major contribution to the historiographical studies, Cypriot studies. The important point to stress here, of course, is that it very much marked a watershed between a lot of the traditional historiographical practices related to Cypriot archaeology and a growing awareness in the need to pay attention to imperial, colonial, and national themes within archaeology. And in the past 20 years since that volume appeared, there has been an absolute explosion in interest in the history of archaeology from a variety of perspectives. People like Tim Murray, in particular, was a pioneer in the history of archaeology from the point of view of the history of science, the history of ideas, and the philosophy of science. He, of course, edited the Encyclopedia of Archaeology, 5 volumes of which appeared in the 1990s and 2000s. And if you just look at this slide here, I've just put up a number of titles of very important books that have appeared in the past 50 years, which have greatly enriched our understanding of the history of archaeology, but also what is the purpose of the history of archaeology. As you know, the history of archaeology was traditionally defined in terms of discoveries by leading individuals, many of them European men. It was also characterized by a lot of growing interest in imperial, colonial, and national influences on the formation of archaeological ideas. But more recently, there's been a number of significant turns that are focusing on a much broader range of aspects of the history of archaeology. And here are just 2 leading titles of Tim Murray's collected edition of papers on the left, but Schlanger and Nordblatt's collected volume, Archives, Ancestors and Practices, very much marked a kind of archival turn, where scholars are turning to the archives, of course, but also to understand the kind of physical aspects of archives, including photographs and drawings. Another important aspect is understanding the archaeology of Cyprus within its broader Eastern Mediterranean context. Two really important books on the archaeology that was taking place within the Ottoman Empire, of course, of which Cyprus was a part. And this simply shows just how important it is to understand what was happening in Cyprus in comparison with other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, in Cyprus itself, the importance of archives and the history of archaeology has a very direct and positive effect on traditional archaeological production. And here are two very fine volumes on old excavations at Lapithos, the first by Menelaus Markides back in 1913, and the second, the American excavations around Lapithos in the 1930s. And both of these volumes are very much reflects the importance of going back into museum reserves and museum archives in order to produce very modern archaeological publications. So, I'm getting closer to the end of my time slot, but I just want to stress a few things about what were the main themes of this workshop. So as I've stressed, many of these themes will be addressed by speakers in later sessions, which we will organize next year. But in the course of thinking about what sort of themes we wanted to get from this conference, we came up with a number of questions, and I'll very quickly run through these. An obvious question would be, how consciously or purposely political was archaeology in Cyprus in the British colonial period? We often assume that it is, but actually we have to think about the relationship between empire and nation and individuals. How do we assess the fieldwork of European and American excavators working on the island at the same time, in the context of other imperial and colonial activity in the broader region? And in this context, it's important to remember that even though the British colonial period was not very long, 82 years, when compared to other parts of the British Empire, you can identify a series of significant shifts. The advent of the British administration in 1878 didn't mark a direct change away from old Ottoman practices in things like archaeology. The annexation of the island in 1914, on the outbreak of the First World War, didn't result in a significant shift either in archaeology. As we all know, the great pioneers of archaeology in the 1920s were not the British, but the Swedes and the French and the Americans. And finally, and ironically, in the 1930s, and we will hear about this from Juliette later, as British rule became more repressive, it was also the period that marked the most proactive intervention by the British authorities in archaeology in the form of the creation of the Department of Antiquities. We also were asked what knowledge of archaeology can be gained from little known or overlooked archival sources such as photography and film. We want to explore the role of underrepresented groups in Cypriot archaeology, social, ethnic, religious, particularly, of course, the role of women and of local Cypriots themselves, which is an absolute must in a post-colonial archaeological environment. We were also interested in the social and economic contexts and histories of excavation and collection, including things like unlicensed digging or looting and the unlicensed export within a longer term perspective. We also want to look at things like the diaspora of Cypriot antiquities across the world, the mechanisms underpinning the formations of collections, and museum strategies of interpretation and display. We are also interested in critical interpretations of the long-term excavation history of individual archaeological sites and regions. Also, we want to investigate how archaeological finds have been recruited to colonial and nationalistic ideology in the British colonial period. And finally, we want to explore how the archaeology, the history of archaeology in this period has been communicated to general audiences. And in a more positive way, we want to understand how we can use the history of archaeology to engage the public in the subject more generally. One of our crucial roles is to engage mass public audiences, and the history of archaeology is in fact a very useful way of doing that. Now, I'm going to stop now and hand back over to Anna, who I think has a few words to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. It's just a quick hello from me before we start the first session. Welcome everybody to the first in our series of online events. It is wonderful to have so many people joining us today. For those I haven't met, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Leeds, working on ancient Cypriot collections in UK museums and their place in the history of Cypriot archaeology, collection and display. We have what I'm sure you'll agree is an interesting and varied programme lined up for the next 2 days. Today we have 2 keynote addresses from Michael Given and Juliette Desplat, and the first panel of papers followed tomorrow by a further 2 panels, each of 3 papers. If you need a copy of the full programme, the link has been pasted into the chat, and it can also be found on the CAARI website. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their contributions to this event and for bearing with us over the last few months as we've moved to an online format. As Lindy said, there will be an opportunity to pose questions to the speakers using the Q&A box, so please do make use of that, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Please also feel free to make use of the chat function to continue conversation during breaks. We hope that this event will be the start of an ongoing conversation, which can continue both at future events and offline. So I'll now hand back to Thomas to introduce our first session this morning.
Hello. You can see me, yes, okay. We are going to keep our introductions to speakers very short and informal. So I will hand straight over to Dr. Michael Given of the University of Glasgow, who will be known to many of you, of course, for his really important work in archaeological survey, but also in archaeological history of Cyprus. And he's going to give us a presentation on surveillance, survey, and local knowledge, landscape relations in late 19th century Cypriot archaeology. And following the formal presentation, we will have a discussion, and then we will open up to questions from the audience. So thank you, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. Hello, everyone. I was going to say it's lovely to see you all, except of course I can't. It's lovely to be in the same virtual space as all of you. I'm very much looking forward to the other papers, to the discussions, the questions and answers, and so on. Okay, so surveillance, survey and local knowledge, landscape relations in early Cypriot archaeology. I think there's a very close connection between seeing and knowing and archaeology. And in a way, the history of archaeology is a history of seeing and knowing, and of course, who gets to see and to know. So in that respect, what I want to be doing is to exploring some of these ways of seeing and knowing in Cypriot archaeology from the 1870s to about 1910. Quite a few of my examples will come from the CAARI landscape, just because that's where I've been working recently. However, I think it's not just about seeing and knowing. Sorry, excuse me. Just sorry, tidying up my screen a little bit here. Because in what, 30 years of post-colonial archaeology, we've got pretty good at deconstructing, analysing colonial archaeological discourses and narratives and representations. You know, we're good at interpreting the ideological foundations of archaeology, of relations of power, of domination, and so on. I think as we've got good at that, it's become clearer and clearer that, of course, archaeology, as we all know who have done it, it's not just about these narratives, about the discourses. Archaeology is something that you do. It's a matter of excavating, of practicing particular skills, of walking systematically across the landscape. It's a performance, and it's a performance with other people. Okay, it's very hard to do archaeology on your own. So the creation of archaeological knowledge is something that's both performative, but it's also relational. It comes out of your connections with the other people in the team, with the people that you meet, that you encounter. And so this understanding of archaeology as a performance, I think, is really, really important for when we're looking back on the history of archaeology. But I'm going to start with a, there we go, sorry, more fiddling with my screen here. I'm going to start with a colonial representation, colonial in the broad sense of the term. For me, this is an iconic or emblematic image of early Cypriot archaeology, because it's about seeing, it's about power and control. There is Cesnola in his white clothes, his big white umbrella catching the eye, standing up on top of the hill, directing his walkers like intensive surveyors. They're banging on the ground to hear where it's hollow, where there's a tomb underneath. And notice the caption, this is General Cesnola. Now, we take that with a pinch of salt, of course, but this is what generals do. They stand up on the hill behind their troops, directing the course of the battle. And he's saying, you know, go there. He's pointing. So this is a great demonstration of archaeology as control over the landscape, over the workers, over the past, over the country. Okay, and here is another one, also Cesnola. Now, this is from his book, okay? So in a way, it's authored by him. He wasn't the artist, but this is how he wants to represent himself. So here he is, he's looking very at home, very comfortable, sitting there under his olive tree in his deck chair, looking out across the landscape, across the Ios Ermogenes plain, that's the Acropolis of Kourion there. And he seems to be looking at it through a telescope that you can see there. So how does he want to portray himself? As someone who can see, as someone who has this power of vision, of the commanding view, of surveillance, and that demonstrates his total control over knowledge of Kourion. Okay, and he's rather on his own. Yes, there's a servant boy preparing his food on the fire there, but it's all about him, and this is, of course, all tied up with the hero narrative of Cesnola's book. But this control over the view, over surveillance, over topography, it's a very familiar now, a colonial motif. And Kitchener's map of Cyprus is a great example of it. Now, it's what I think of as a parade. Kitchener has got a way of seeing the topography because of his colonial background, because of his actual surveying methodology. And he has got this tremendous technology. So you see the theodolite there, but this is paraded across the landscape. And Gail Smith has got a very nice paper on the Ordnance Survey in Ireland doing this. And so he's parading their uniforms, their control, their technology, their ability to see to the audience of local villagers all across Cyprus where they go. And the product, of course, is this God's eye view. It shows topographic precision and detail and accuracy and so on. But I think there's more going on to it than this. And of course, Kitchener is a very interesting person who was very interested in the archaeology of Cyprus, ran his own excavations. His article in 1879 about Cyprus shows a very interesting and perceptive understanding of landscape features, topography, soil, and so on, and how local communities are embedded in it and the diversity of that relationship, which is very interesting. And what strikes me about this map that you see here is it's not just about seeing and knowing, it's about listening. Because all of these names here, Kyparissiotis, the church there, Rias Dimitrianos, and so on, the surveyors didn't know that. They had to ask, they had to listen to local people who, of course, have this landscape knowledge. And so this map is not just a colonial artifact. There's actually some collaboration here in a very unequal relationship of power, of course. But there is participation from the local villagers who have the local knowledge of the landscape. Now, archaeology is, of course, or archaeological practice is closely related to this. And what I like about the British Museum notebooks here, and Paulina Nicolaou's got a fantastic article about this. Is these are, as she puts it, these are the paper tools for the construction of knowledge. So the British Museum archaeologists there, they are encountering, they're practicing, they're in the landscape, they're experiencing it, but they have to translate this into objective, authoritative knowledge. And what we're seeing here in the notebooks is that process of translation. So we just as Kitchener, we got the nice God's Eye View map with the scale and so on, all of this technology. We've got another one here of Site B, just below the Acropolis there. It's still at this stage, it's still provisional. So several unsuccessful attempts to find tombs with material becomes numerous unsuccessful attempts. Clearly it got worse as they went along. They were unhappy with the original map, and they stuck this one over. And then the next stage of this process is, of course, the publication, where all of the crossings out and the stickings on are removed, and it is authoritative, objective knowledge. However, just as with Kitchener, there are other participants who might be there in the early diary-like accounts, but are gradually erased out of the narrative, out of the discourse. So we have to ask, what about the Cypriot archaeologists? Archaeologists in the broad sense of the term, so the workers, the local informants, the antiquarians, the middlemen. And we can see in the gaps in the colonial narratives, in the interstices between them, we can see evidence for them. You have to look quite hard. This is a fairly typical example. There, bang in the middle of the frame, is John Myers, very smart in his Norfolk jacket. We know who he is. We know his name. His four assistants there, slightly out on the periphery. We don't know their names. We don't know their precise roles. They are quite distinct from Myers in the way they're standing, the way they're dressed. We don't know who they are, but they're there at least. There is one particular window into this world of the local Cypriot participants in these early colonial projects. This one I particularly like. I've called it the carob tree with three trunks. This is thanks to George McFadden in the early 1950s. He was particularly interested in a tomb that had been excavated in an unlicensed excavation 50 years before in Kaloriziki, which is this triangular field just here. We're standing up on the Acropolis of Kourion, looking across the Ios Ermogenes plain. The Church of Ios Ermogenes is just in the trees here. He found out from the records that it was excavated by, and we've got the names, which is great, Sokratis Stylianou and Marcos Eleftheriou from Episcopi, and Mavrosavas, originally from Larnaca, presumably then living in Episcopi with the others. And among other things, they found the famous gold and enamel scepter, perhaps like Bronze Age, perhaps archaic. Hence, of course, McFadden's interest. So what McFadden does is he goes and talks to the old men in the village. Excellent archaeological methodology, not practiced by everyone though. And through them, he manages to meet Sokratis, who by this point is quite elderly and actually very ill. But all credit to Sokratis. He talks to McFadden and he tells him where the tomb was from 50 years before. And what is interesting here is the depth of Sokratis's landscape knowledge. Sokratis said that on the scarp at Rizo Carpasso there's a fig tree. 20 meters away from it, there is a carob tree with three trunks. And in between them is a wild hawthorn tree, and the tomb was at the base of the wild hawthorn tree. These, by the way, are not the actual trees, so I think my carob tree there does actually have three trunks. So off went McFadden and his team from the university to Pennsylvania, and they found the fig tree and they found the carob tree, and exactly in between they put in a trench and they found first of all the roots of the wild hawthorn, and then they found the tomb itself and did a very nice re-excavation and publication of it. So what strikes me here is the depth of local knowledge and understanding and history of the landscape by Sokratis. Also, interestingly, while McFadden was excavating, along came an old Turk and watched them, and that old Turk, who's unnamed, had also watched Sokratis and his team excavating 50 years before. Okay. So to me, this is a local archaeological knowledge. This is a local archaeology, independent of these methodologies and ideologies being brought in from outside. And this same local archaeology, I think, is expressed very nicely in the sort of the background to this map. This is one of the successors of Kitchener's map from the 1910s and 1920s, the 1 in 5,000 cadastral map. And it's all about colonial control and knowledge. It's about the boundaries between properties. It's about land registry and taxation. But as well as that, and as well as the numbers for each plot, they interviewed local people to come up to find all of these local topothesias, these locality names. And you can see tremendous knowledge in them of where the walnuts grow well, and the local characteristic vegetation, myrtle and fennel, and so on. The churches and so on, including where the church is long gone, Stavrosis here, Ayathekla. And the antiquities as well. So there's At Meydan, horse track. That's exactly what it means. Paleokastron, or Old Castle. That's the Acropolis at Kourion. The tannery, which I'm sure was long gone by the time the surveyors did their interviews. Now, of course, this information is variously transliterated and translated and selected in and selected out, and there's still unequal relations of power going on. But this is a tremendous source of local understandings of landscape and archaeology. Incidentally, if anyone in the audience is a specialist or has an interest in these topothesias, could help me out, and here's some that I haven't managed to figure out. I would love to hear from them. But it's not just about these local knowledges of landscape and antiquity. The materiality of the past is really important in local society as well. And I think spolia make a really nice demonstration of it. Really common, I think, particularly in the 17th century. This is something that I need to keep on working on. But to take one example out of many, this is the church of Archangel Michael Tripiotis in the old city in Nicosia. And you can see the two main doors in the west and the south have these lovely lintels and corbels and coat of arms above them. And this is not just a free source of masonry. They have a role, they have a meaning. Okay, they're doing something. They have agency. There's material artifacts which have been incorporated into a new biography in this building. There's certainly apotropaic power. There's protection of the vulnerable threshold going on just here. I particularly like these wonderful lions here. But also there's a sense of antiquity, particularly the marble, the Gothic style and everything. They're very, very clearly older. Now, there's not necessarily a very precise chronology that we might have, but just particularly here, this white marble against the blonde sandstone, they stand out, they're older, they bring antiquity. And it's interesting that with almost all of these churches, there's a succession. So the rebuilt from the foundations is a common phrase that you get in foundation inscriptions like this. So they show the antiquity and the continuity of the church. These artifacts from the past have a meaning today. Okay, this is an archaeology. This is a local archaeology. Artifacts too. So Aisermayenis, the church in the plain below Kourion that I've mentioned. Here we are inside. There's the modern tomb cover there. But here we have a Roman period cypress from the cemetery, which is in and all around the church, which functions very nicely as an icon stand here. Here's another one in Mathiati. This is a cave church. There's a cave through here. It's a very long time since I've been there, and I haven't managed to get back to it. I was going to go in the summer, but that didn't happen, of course. Could this also be a Roman tomb, as was very common in some of these saints' chapels? And here is an incense altar and an icon stand. Now, creating this material link with the past is very, very important, particularly in churches of specific saints who are buried there, okay? Because the whole point is that this is the spot where the saint's body was found and the church was built, and there's a continuity going forward across the centuries. And so it's these artifacts of antiquity which actually create that continuity, that authenticity, really. So the authenticity of the cult of the saint is generated through these artifacts. A tremendously rich and meaningful archaeology that's going on here. And notice it's about the discovery as well. It's not just it happened to be there, but the stories of the discovery of these artifacts, the excavation, if you like, plays a really, really important role. Now, you can see there's numerous stories in Exacta Cypria. Local church websites are great sources of these stories of discovery. The Ukrainian Orthodox pilgrim Basil Barsky, I found, just flicking through, I found 5 of them. Here's a couple of examples. So Ayia Napa, the holy cave, that's his etymology of it, a meaningful etymology, obviously, at the time. And it was called that for originally in this cave was found a miracle working icon where it still remains. Now, notice his wording, originally, still. Okay, so the icon generates that authenticity and antiquity and continuity. Okay, it was originally found there and it's still there and it's still miracle working. So the ongoing power of that artifact is generated by the antiquity and continuity of that story. And then another one there from Stavros Tismitou. Perhaps the most famous example of Greek Orthodox archaeology, or a specific excavation project, if you like, came from 488, when the Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch was threatening to take over the Church of Cyprus, which hitherto had been autonomous. So the Archbishop of Cyprus at the time, Anthemios, here he is deeply concerned about what's going to happen, but along came Saint Barnabas. And he's extending his right hand, which is the conduit for the power of God, from the right hand of God to the right hand of saint, and to the mortal. And with his left hand, he's pointing off to the landscape. And then we move to the next scene. So here we are in the landscape, and there's some little bushes and a rocky hill and a nice tree here. And here's Anthemios. He's now wearing his archbishop's robes and his stole and everything. He's got the thurifer here, who's swinging the incense burner, a couple of acolytes carrying the candles. It's all got to be done properly. Okay, there's a methodology to excavation, a proper way of doing it. And they've excavated here in the side of the hill. And here are their excavation tools. Here's their pointed spade and their mattock. And look, they have found the uncorrupted body of Saint Barnabas himself. And just to be sure, just as evidence for that, on his chest is the Gospel of Saint Matthew that Saint Barnabas himself wrote out, and it has the first words at the beginning, Biblos Genesios, to the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, son of David, and so on. And thanks to this miracle, the church retains its autonomy. Now, this obviously is a continuing and powerful story. And the saint and just the story itself and this image of the story continue to have agency and power within the history of the Church of Cyprus. So this particular painting is from 1730. The Church of St. John the Theologian, the Archbishopric Church in Nicosia. And the Archbishop at the time was Silvestros when this was painted, and he had moved his Archbishopric to Nicosia, and this had just become the Archbishop's Church. So he is showing the continuity of him as Archbishop going back to Anthemios and back to Barnabas himself. Okay, so again, authenticity and power comes through antiquity and continuity, and there is this elaborate and rich Orthodox archaeology which is generating all of this. Okay, so we've explored some ways of seeing and knowing, particularly colonial ways of seeing and knowing, and deconstructing these sort of narratives, I think, remains really important. What is really interesting about them, I think, is the collaborations that are hidden underneath. Unequal collaborations, but there is really important and interesting and nuanced generation of knowledge that's going on there from these other unacknowledged collaborators. More widely than that, I think there's a wide range of absolutely fascinating and really important local archaeologies that are going on. And I've highlighted the richness of local understandings of the landscape, of past practices, of relations between people and environment going back generations and generations. And then there's Greek Orthodox archaeologies and the importance of the materiality of relics or crosses or swords or the holy rope, well, whatever it might be, and their power in creating the ongoing authenticity and authority and practice of the Greek Orthodox faith. I do wonder what other local archaeologies are out there. I would love to hear any suggestions you might have. I think there's a rich field of research there in exploring these various local archaeologies. Also, I think, like all thinking about the history of archaeology, it makes us reflect on our own practice. And I do wonder, how can we perform other sorts of archaeology than the familiar Western scientific ones? Or better put, how can we create new hybrid archaeologies which combine what we can bring from the scientific or the methodological traditions, our data sets and so on, and to make a hybrid collaborative archaeology with perhaps orthodox understandings of the landscape or other local understandings of the landscape. So again, any suggestions, ideas, contributions, I would love to hear from you, because I think it's really important and interesting to understand all of these other ways of seeing and knowing and listening and other ways of doing archaeology. Thank you very much.